there. I thought it would be interesting to do something a little bit different, maybe start a video series on this of just reading other people's work. So I was going to read an essay from this book, Radical Orthodoxy. It's a collection of essays. And so really what this collection of essays is looking to do is essentially reclaiming the world by situating its concerns and activities within a theological framework in relation to radical orthodoxy. So it's not simply returning in nostalgia to the pre-modern world, but these essays visit sites in which secularism has invested heavily. So this is aesthetics, politics, sex, the body, personhood, visibility, space, place, etc. And so it resituates them from a Christian standpoint. That is, in terms of the Trinity, Christology, the Church, and the Eucharist. So what emerges is a contemporary theological project that's made possible by the superficiality of today's secularism. So it's really this book is a conversation of theology and secularism. It's very interesting stuff. So I was going to read for you, it is the fourth essay in here, and oh my goodness gracious. It is, so this is the fourth essay. It's on nihilism, Heidegger and the Grounds of Redemption. And so this essay is written by Laurence Paul Hemming. And so I'll just read it for you in bits and pieces. I think this is a really good piece that puts philosophy and theology into conversation specifically around nihilism. It has become commonplace to oppose nihilism to Christian faith. Coupled to this has been the prevailing sense that Christianity is losing the battle with a riptide of secularity. The varying shades of theological liberalism of the post-war period, either explicitly or implicitly, have represented a response to this, itself little more than a feeling, although backed up by a consensus claiming a basis in sociological fact. Again, the influence of liberalism has been a kind of conservatism, sometimes styled as a neo-orthodoxy, which has sought through various, often authoritarian means to roll back the tide in a triumphal assertion of Christian truth, through fundamentalisms of differing hues, biblical, moral, or ecclesial. The pressure mounting, particularly in the United States, for a millennial infallible statement from the Vatican proclaiming Mary as co-redemptrix and mediatrix of all graces is a good example of this. Concern with orthodoxy appears exemplified by a concern with Mary. Framed correctly, there need be no actual problem with the dogma. We are we not, all called to be co-redeemers and mediators of grace? What Mary exemplifies, we are also called to be. Indeed, as co-redeemers, we must first be co-creating. That this movement is neo-orthodox is indicated in that, were they ever proclaimed in the way being sought, the dogmas would have the effect of detaching the working out of the nature of human salvation from Mary's person, which has been her role, above all, in the first centuries of the Church's life, as even so cautious a Mariologist as Karl Barth attests. The danger arises of appearing to stand the Mother of God anthropologically over against the common mass of humanity. Quite apart from the potential difficulties of ecumenism, the real motive appears to be the desire, not so much to clarify points of Marian dogma, as for an infallible statement that will settle dispute by edict, and so exemplify not the power of God revealed through Mary, but the power of the papacy as such. The explicit view of this essay is that orthodoxy is orthodox because it is in the vanguard of the working out of questions concerning faith and salvation, and never bringing up an angry or reluctant rear. The marks of orthodoxy might be well described as openness, generosity, and risk, or what in a different age would have easily been described as self-abandonment. In this essay, I want to show what nihilism is and how it came about, and to answer this question by showing its relation to the unfolding of scholasticism's concern with esse and ens as determinations of being, and to Nietzsche's understanding of the death of God. If scholasticism concludes by seeking to speak of being as a way of speaking of God, nihilism, in speaking of the death of God, is also seeking to speak of being, which means to speak of how things are, and in particular to appeal to Martin Heidegger as one who seeks to understand what it means to speak of being, and thereby to show how his speaking of being speaks of the overcoming of nihilism. I want to raise the question of how we might speak faithfully again of God and being in consequence of Heidegger's work. So his understanding of faith has to do with how truth and time are thought. Faithfulness is so, not because I attempt to bring myself into conformity with a particularly conceived tradition of body of thought, a kind of correspondence of myself to what is true, carried out as an act of will and its repetitions, in which therefore is always looking backwards into what has gone before as the deciding and so decisive determination of my being true as being faithful. This understanding of time immediately raises the unfolding development of tradition as a problem. Rather, I belong to the tradition as something which lies ahead of me, and from within which, and so out of which, I am formed. Tradition, the traditio, or handing over, is not simply something which is handed over to me, but rather something over to which I am first delivered and proper to. In this sense, I am constituted for the tradition as being in an intimate dialogue with it. I am the potential horizon of its being made actual, its realization. Thought in terms of salvation, my being is the place where, through this conversation, this being proper to, God comes to be, which means the how of my being Christian will indicate something about me from the perspective of my growth and maturity in Christ, and something about God, how God comes to be found in me by others. From this perspective, faith becomes the conditioning mode of making something real, of bringing it about. What does my faith make real? Faith in God, specifically in the God of Christianity, makes God real within the horizon of my I, which is to say, faith in God makes me the horizon where God is made real and so expressed. In this sense, my time with God is not just something I spend in church and prayer and so on, but time I create as a way of being in the world. Faithfulness, my being appropriated by the Christian tradition, can in this way be understood only as what forms me as a faithful person. Orthodoxy is a possible way, a how, of my realization of God, in this case, of God as realized in Christ. It is in this sense that, from the perspective of Christianity, I am as alter Christus, another Christ. Implicit in this view is that orthodoxy is partly disclosed in the how, the manner of its discourse, as much as in the what of its content. This how and what are modes of disclosure of being human. Thought as faith, they order the orthodox person towards her and his fellow beings and towards God. This ordering can best be understood as piety, for piety is the mode of disclosure of my being together with God. Orthodoxy in this sense ceases to be assertion and is better understood as prayer, and most formally as sacrament, as relationship to God, brought about in the communal speech of the assembly, as a mode of being of Christ, a mode of revelation of something not human, the divine, with something human, me, the assembly. An outline, and it is here no more than a sketch, this is the way in which many of the patristic authors at least thought the relationship between God, the creation, and the human person, pluriformity, redeemed as unity. So what has this to do with nihilism? For Nietzsche, nihilism is a normal state of affairs, which we might paraphrase to mean nihilism is the prevailing condition of the end of modernity. What then do we mean by nihilism? For Nietzsche, what brings nihilism to light is the normal state of affairs, is the spoken proclamation, God is dead. Michael Gillespie has claimed a different provenance for nihilism, tracing its origin to nominalism and questions concerning human freedom. In Gillespie's view, it was William of Ockham's rejection of the scholastic reconciliation of theology and philosophy that laid the basis for an understanding of the divine that leads, in fact, to nihilism. Gillespie notes that for Occam, omnipotence means the supremacy of God's potentia absoluta over his potentia ordinata, and of theology over philosophy. For Occam, God is the only necessary being, and so there is, considered in one way, a fundamental difference between the being of God and the being of created things. Creation in this sense is contingent, which means that every creature or created thing is radically dependent for its existence on the will of God. This in turn means that no creature is in any sense dependent on or explained by creation in general, but it is explicable. The idea of divine omnipotence thus means that human beings can never be certain that any of the impressions they have correspond to an actual object. Occam's position is in fact the radical assertion of interiority. Gillespie notes that Occam even cites Augustine's claim that the greatest certainty is a certainty that I know that I am living. Put like this, Descartes' cogito ergo sum, seems but a short step away. Indeed, and Gillespie would not be the first to hint towards it, the question remains whether Augustine or Occam and not only Descartes, are the founders of modern subjectivity. What has this to do with nihilism? For Nietzsche, nihilism is a normal state of affairs, which we might paraphrase to mean nihilism is the prevailing condition of the end of modernity. What then do we mean by nihilism? For Nietzsche, what brings nihilism to light is the normal state of affairs is the spoken proclamation that God is dead. Michael Gillespie has claimed a different provenance for nihilism, tracing its origin to nominalism and questions concerning human freedom. In Gillespie's view, it was William of Occam's rejection of the scholastic reconciliation of theology and philosophy that laid the basis for an understanding of the divine that leads, in fact, to nihilism. Gillespie notes that for Occam, omnipotence means the supremacy of God's potentia absoluta over his potentia ordinata, and of theology over philosophy. For Occam, God is the only necessary being, and so there is, considered in one way, a fundamental difference between the being of God and the being of created things. Creation in this sense is contingent, which means that every creature or created thing is radically dependent for its existence on the will of God. This in turn means that no creature is in any sense dependent on or explained by creation in general, but is explicable only in consequence of the divine will. Gillespie concludes, for Occam, the idea of divine omnipotence thus means that human beings can never be certain that any of the impressions they have correspond to an actual object. Occam's position is, in fact, the radical assertion of interiority. Gillespie notes that Occam even cites Augustine's claim that the greatest certainty is a certainty that I know that I am living. Put like this, Descartes' cogito ergo sum seems but a short step away. Indeed, and Gillespie would not be the first to hint towards it, the question remains whether Augustine or Occam, and not only Descartes, are the founders of modern subjectivity. So in fact, caution needs to be exercised, not least because it is not at all self-evident that living is the same as thinking, in the sense that it would have been at all intelligible for Augustine that I might live apart from creation. The radical departure signified by Occam and brought to fruition by Descartes is that to live is possible apart from world or creation, such that world or creation then become objects or domains of objects, which have to be explained subsequent to my discovery that I live, rather than being the conditioning possibility for any explanation at all. More important still, my to live is the only thing which I might explain apart from God, assuming my radical dependence on his will, which means that even in the face of an omnipotent God, my I live, or I think, is the only thing of which I might be certain, irrespective of the omnipotence of God. And the most radical aspect of Occam's formulation is that in its denial of the meaning of creation, God comes to be understood as a being apart from any human being, and most particularly apart from me. Occam prepares the way for God to become an object of theological investigation. So his very separation of the human from the divine in this way, with its concomitant devaluation of creation, actually has the effect of bringing creator and creature under the same determination, that of being. So this is exactly the position arrived at by Duns Scotus in De Metaphysica. Scotus says, for God is not known to us naturally unless being is univocal to the created and uncreated. This leads him to conclude, thus it follows that if some being is finite, then some being is infinite. Finally, we learn that being is a subject and God is the end of metaphysics. This demonstrates conclusively that the position often erroneously ascribed to Aquinas is in fact held by Duns Scotus, that God is known by way of an inquiry into being, and therefore that God is as univocal primum ens as is the same as being, which for St. Thomas the whole doctrine of analogy was set up to avoid, and therefore that God is understood as summum ens and ens finis. It shows also that for Scotus, God is not subsumed under being, where being is a separate and so higher category from God, but that God as highest infinite being subsumes all created things as univocally dependent on him. So whereas it can be argued that Dionysius and Aquinas used the language of metaphysics to work out an understanding of God, with Scotus and Occam, the question of the nature of God comes to be worked out solely as a metaphysics. So one of the most important thinkers to point to this, at least with respect to Aquinas, is Martin Heidegger. In 1931 lecture course, he describes the doctrine of analogy as a formula which played the role of a welcomed means of formulating a religious conviction in philosophical terms. So he adds that by use of this formula, ens infinitum and ins finitum, both can be named ends, though both be thought of the same concept, being. So about the same time, he pointed out that Thomas and medieval philosophy are important only to a lesser extent for the development of modern metaphysics. Direct influence was exercised by one theologian and philosopher, the Spanish Jesuit Franz Suarez. So Aquinas continues to maintain that nothing can be said or known concerning the essence of God in itself. God and God's essence is known only through God's effects, so i.e. in creation. This means that insofar as Aquinas is inquiring into God through an inquiry into being, essay, being is still understood as creation or created being. So what Aquinas is doing if he is not undertaking a metaphysics? Aquinas' understanding of being, essay, and the being of God are, I would contend, strictly elaborated in virtue of his understanding of salvation. So when Aquinas asks whether essence and existence are the same under God, he replies to the second objection by saying that essay can be understood in two ways, either as an act of being, actus essendi, of a thing in creation, or as the composition of a proposition affected in the soul, the anima. The existence of God is understood only in this second sense, as a spiritual act. He concludes, we know that this proposition, which we form about God when we say God is true, God is true. And this we know from God's effects. So the existence of God is only in consequence an act of mine, an act, we might say, of my speaking to myself. God's existence is realized in mine. So the question becomes how? The how of God's existence realized in mine must in general mean the spiritual life, my way of being in Christ, which means what of Christ is realized in me. To call God summum ens is therefore to refer to myself. I am the only ens that, strictly speaking, can be referred to here. Summum must therefore be that way in which I realize God. So summum highest is a rising up to the heights to know God, to be godly. It is a manner of my being. So I'm reminded here of Eckhart's claim that to God's word I must be bevort, an adverb. This is not a metaphysical projection. It is where I am to be carried to know God. So in contrast, it is certainly debatable that Suarez and Cajetan's reading of Aquinas rendered Thomism as a metaphysics, and that the soteriological force of Aquinas' understanding of essay being falls away. So for Aquinas, being as creation is the place in which God is to be realized, and in so realizing, creation is literally divinized and redeemed. So in consequence of nominalism, however, being ceases to mean being created, which means it ceases in any sense to explain creation except as a formal, logical dependence. The bringing about of God as a being means the bringing about of one who can also be declared to be dead. And it means simultaneously the bringing about of an object who lies beyond, outside, or other than the subject who knows this. For Heidegger, the coming to fruition of the elaboration of subjectivity, first in Descartes and finally in Hegel and Nietzsche, was only the playing out of the end of the whole history of metaphysics. For him, theology as Christian philosophy belongs firmly within the realm of metaphysics, hence his elaboration of the term ontotheology in his 1936 lectures on Schelling. He understood metaphysics to assume that being and God are the same. The word ontotheology says no more than this. What does it mean for God and being to be the same? Heidegger says that God and being is the thought of being as a whole and highest being, construed as what gives being to beings, what is most beingful about them, what lies prior to them, and so makes it possible for them to be. Heidegger draws the distinction between metaphysics construing being in this way, which is beingness, the beingness of beings, and so remains a being rather than das Sein, being itself, which is not a being. He adds, every philosophy is theology in the original and essential sense that the conceiving of beings as a whole asks about the ground of being. and this ground becomes the name God, named as God. Indeed, Nietzsche's philosophy, for instance, in which an essential saying states God is dead, is in accord with this saying, theology. The theological question in metaphysics is contrasted to the ontological question, the question of beings as such. Philosophy, in the widest sense, then, is ontotheology. The more originally it is both in one, the more authentically is it philosophy. For Heidegger, all that is under consideration, either in philosophy or in theology, construed metaphysically, is the nature of beings, either as a whole or in particular. So even when we are treating this topic in relation to God, nothing more is actually said about God than that God is beings as a whole. In other words, this is an inquiry determined solely by what we find in the world and allows for nothing outside it. It is already solely factical. Far from Heidegger being the champion of a nihilism that disbars anything beyond the purely phenomenal, the purely factical, in which role he has certainly been portrayed, Heidegger's accusation is that metaphysics is already this facticity in nihilism. Heidegger's understanding of metaphysics is that God is in consequence of the hidden transcending of being human. Put more clearly, God, as thought in metaphysics, is not the God of faith, but a consequence of the way metaphysics thinks transcendence. What has been overlooked in much scholarship concerning Heidegger's discussion of God is that for him, the coming about of nihilism historically, and most particularly in the declaration God is dead, actually makes it possible to think about the essence of God at all. The spoken declaration God is dead declares dead only the God of metaphysics and not the God of faith. There has been a lingering suspicion that for Heidegger, either God is subsumed under the phenomenology of being, the accusation that he is in some sense a modern-day Scotist, or as Jean-Luc Marion has suggested, that Heidegger's God is an idol, or for that Heidegger being is simply a secularized notion of God. So for Heidegger, to think God in terms of being is to impose limit and finitude on God. Heidegger noted in 1931 that Meister Eckhart says God is not at all because being is a finite predicate and absolutely cannot be said of God. And Heidegger understood the temporal analytic of Dasein, outlined in Being and Time, to have demonstrated decisively that human existence cannot be accounted for apart from the world. He makes exactly the same point when in Zurich in 1951 he was asked, "Need being and God be posited as identical?" He replies, referring specifically to St. Thomas Aquinas, "God and being is not identical. Being and God are not identical. And I would never attempt to think the essence of God through being. If I were yet to write a theology, to which I sometimes feel inclined, then the word being would not occur in it." There is no syntactical error here, and the move from is to are in the reply is the very movement of Heidegger's thinking through the separation of being and God from their metaphysically posited togetherness. So Heidegger added in the same seminar, "I believe that being can never be thought as the ground and essence of God." There is here a deliberate play on the words believe and think. Heidegger begins by saying that faith and the thinking of being have no need for each other. The next sentences begin, "I think and I believe." In what follows, it becomes clear that thinking points us away from determining the essence of God, while believing points us toward that place where God appears within the dimension of being, insofar as God meets with humanity. So each mode of human being determines us differently with regard to God. Thinking, then, points us in one direction with regard to God. Thinking yields its own history as a coming to itself in both appropriating and pointing towards the overcoming of metaphysics. Believing points us towards the experience of God's revelation, to God as appearing in the realm of being, insofar as he meets with humanity. Thinking cannot determine in advance, which means from out of the content and structure of thinking itself and what is given to thinking to think of, the God who will be met, who might appear insofar as God does in the realm of being. The separation of faith and thinking opens up a critique of the necessity of explaining God metaphysically. Thinking opens a space in which theology, as reflection on faith, can clarify and correct its reflection. Above all, this space is not founding, which means it does not determine the outcome of what is to be thought, only how as a reflection on experience, on a content given from elsewhere than thought itself. So it becomes clear, therefore, that the project to destructure the metaphysics of subjectivity announced by Being and Time has, as a consequence, a rethinking of the way the nature of God has been thought. In the light of Heidegger's work, in the proclamation God is dead or God does not exist, might the contested meaning be not the word God, but the word exist, so that what God names is able to be secured in itself apart from existence, and only contestable when brought into the realm of existence or being. Might it not just be that Nietzsche's proclamation of the death of God leaves open the question of God's essence? I have already indicated that this bringing into the realm of can be understood to occur within the horizon of my own unfolding existence. If we pursue this inquiry beyond what Heidegger himself was willing to say, could it not also have a Trinitarian reference, in the sense that God enters the realm of existence as the second person of the divine Trinity? This is not so problematic when it concerns the person of Jesus, but what about the Old Testament revelation? Here again, we have a hint from the patristic writers, among others, that the revelation of God both in creation and in the Old Testament is through the second person of the divine Trinity. In Heidegger's difficult but important work, Betrage zur Philosophie, dating from 1936 to 38, there is in the 7th division a section entitled Der letzte Gott, the last God. This section opens with a chapter called simply The Last. I'm not going to read it in German. Here we are told that the last God has its most unique singularity and stands outside each reckoning determination which the titles monotheism, pantheism, and atheism intend. Monotheism and all kinds of theism come about as the Judeo-Christian apologetic, which takes for granted the thinking of metaphysics. With the death of God, all theisms collapse. So for Heidegger, all theisms, of which atheism is also a determination, we might note, the determination which historically brought theism into light as theism, are determinations of the same thing. What thing? Metaphysics. With Nietzsche's madman's proclamation of the death of God, re-echoed throughout Thus Spoke Zarathustra, metaphysical thinking is seen for the first time as that thinking which speaks of God as a being, an existence that renders and reckons the thing, God, as an object, a reckoning reckoned by a subject. The God who appears not in the realm of being, but in the subject-object distinction. Heidegger says, the word God is dead is not an atheistic doctrinal principle, but the formula for the basic experience of an event of Western history. The word event here translates as das Ereignis. I'm sorry, I cannot read German. The word Nietzsche himself uses in Die Frohliche Wissenschaft. This word is also used to describe nihilism itself. For Heidegger says, we can say, in turning towards the word itself, that nihilism is an event that means a doctrine, which is a concern with the nihil, the nothing. Considered formally, the nothing is the negation of something, indeed of every something. All something constitutes beings as a whole. The positing of the nothing is the negation of beings as a whole. So nihilism is that event which brings before us as a basic or grounding experience that there is beings as a whole. The something in general, God, and it brings us before it in the character of annihilation. Heidegger presents nihilism as the bringing together of God, understood as beings as a whole, with the nothing. To speak of the death of God is to speak of how beings are now grounded differently, no longer in God, but in the subject. In other words, creation, or being, which was understood by nominalism as the radical dependence of all things on the will of God, now becomes, in valuation and the concern with the nothing, the radical dependence of all things for their meaning and their existence on me as subject. It is here that we might take gentle issue with Michael Gillespie's claim that nihilism has a resonance different from that suggested by Nietzsche. Nietzsche's madman's proclamation sums up, speaks of, and resonates as the very history that Gillespie outlines. Nietzsche's brilliant understanding of his word is that the omnipotence of God is supplanted by a claim to omnipotence of the subject, the will to power as reevaluating. At its outset, metaphysics conceives God as the ground of beings as a whole, as what underpins them as their founding possibility. For Heidegger's interpretation of Nietzsche, nihilism is the event of the dwindling away of the weight out of all weighty things, the fact of the misplacing of the center of gravity. In the death of God, the ground becomes groundless and weightless. It floats off. This has the effect of depriving things of their weight. Nihilism is therefore also the experience of the coming about of ground or basis as something other than God, namely subjectivity, figured in the will to power. The weightiest of thoughts and the hardest is the eternal recurrence of the same. What is the eternal recurrence of the same in relation to beings as a whole? The eternal recurrence of the same is the securing of all things as the permanentizing of presence, being secured in terms of becoming. So God is the ground of all things is the inverse of this. This understanding is of the securing of all things, everything that becomes is in consequence of what most is, God. Becoming is secured in terms of being. Here, therefore, is the explanation why, for Heidegger, Nietzsche's nihilism is a movement that is above all a counter-movement, an inverted Platonism. This event brings to light the circular movement, which is the fulfillment of Western metaphysics. Always in these various ways of understanding event, there are two contrary movements taking place from the perspective of a third place or a site. For at the same time as the will to power, the eternal return of the same, the death of God, and the basic experience and determination of nihilism come about and are seen for what they are for the first time in Nietzsche's philosophy, so also is the possibility of the turn out of nihilism and the promise of yielding the promise of something new, more original, and deeper than went before. This moment, this yielding of a sight which appears literally, arrives to put the I in question, which means appears as the very putting of the I into that question which is to be asked, the being question. This alone is das Ergebnis. This putting of the self into question is also named in Sinn und Zeit, and as the structural analytic of das Sinn. To be in the place of questioning is to be there, das Sinn. Have I never been questionable before? How, for instance, did the subject first come into view? And is that not a self-questioning? Heidegger remarks that in the coming about of the subject, and the only thing that is not put into question is me. Descartes begins philosophizing with doubt, and it seems everything is put into question, yet it only seems so. Das Sinn, the I, the ego, never comes into question at all. All that is ever put into question is knowledge, consciousness of things. In this way, metaphysics as a history of being comes into view for the first time as questionable. This question-worthiness can be understood as asking, how did God arrive in philosophy? If metaphysics takes God as ground, and if the move out of metaphysics shows the ground to be groundless, then precisely that thinking which brings me before the being question is the thinking about ground that also shows me how metaphysics came to think God as ground. When I become questionable, the God whom I took as ground prior to questioning is also put into question with me for the first time. God enters the question not as a Gutsfrage, but put into the questioning and questionable, the Sinnfrage, or being question. Oh my gosh. In Identity and Difference, I'm not reading the German, Heidegger notes, the question about the ontotheological character of metaphysics is sharpened into the question, how did God enter into philosophy not only in the modern period, but philosophy as such? The question lets itself be answered only after it has been sufficiently unfolded as a question. How could it be sufficiently unfolded? In the being question, Heidegger notes that the question comes about as a conversation with the whole history of philosophy. How can this conversation come about? By the interrogation of my study of this history and by interrogating my having been thought, and this means produced by this history. I am in consequence of how am or being has been thought and not thought in the West, and that means in the whole history of Western philosophy. A further question also unfolds, a being question, not a God question. Who now is the God? All right, I'm going to finish this essay in a second video, so be on the lookout for that. Thanks for listening, and also sorry about my very shaky German pronunciations. Thanks so much.